Frederick Douglass's autobiography is absolutely gripping from beginning to end. But as a teacher, one part naturally interested me more than any other: his education. Let's start with a quick look at the legacy of his mother in Chapter 3. To me it has ever been a grief that I knew my mother so little, and have so few of her words treasured in my remembrance. I have since learned that she was the only one of all the colored people in Tuckahoe who could read. How she acquired this knowledge I know not, for Tuckahoe was the last place in the world where she would have been likely to find facilities for learning. I can therefore fondly and proudly ascribe to her an earnest love of knowledge. That a field hand should learn to read in any slave state is remarkable, but the achievement of my mother, considering the place and circumstances, was very extraordinary. Chapters 10 through 12 describe his own quest to learn to read and write after he moved from the plantation to the home of his new owners, Hugh and Sophia Auld, in Baltimore, Maryland. The frequent hearing of my mistress reading the Bible aloud, for she often read aloud when her husband was absent, awakened my curiosity in respect to this mystery of reading, and roused in me the desire to learn. Up to this time, I had known nothing whatever of this wonderful art, and my ignorance and inexperience of what it could do for me, as well as my confidence in my mistress, emboldened me to ask her to teach me to read. With an unconsciousness and an experience equal to my own, she readily consented, and in an incredibly short time, by her kind assistance, I had mastered the alphabet and could spell words of 3 or 4 letters. My mistress seemed almost as proud of my progress as if I had been her own child, and supposing that her husband would be as well pleased, she made no secret of what she was doing for me. Indeed, she exultingly told him of the aptness of her pupil, and of her intention to persevere in teaching me, as she felt her duty to do, at least to read the Bible. And here arose the first dark cloud over my Baltimore prospects, the precursor of chilling blasts and drenching storms. Master Hugh was astounded beyond measure, and probably for the first time proceeded to unfold to his wife the true philosophy of the slave system, and the peculiar rules necessary in the nature of the case to be observed in the management of human chattels. Of course, he forbade her to give me any further instruction, telling her in the first place that to do so was unlawful, as it was also unsafe. If he learns to read the Bible, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. He should know nothing but the will of his master, and learn to obey it. As to himself, learning will do him no good but a great deal of harm, making him disconsolate and unhappy. If you teach him how to read, he'll want to know how to write, and this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself. Such was the tenor of Master Hugh's oracular exposition, and it must be confessed that he very clearly comprehended the nature and the requirements of the relation of master and slave. His discourse was the first decidedly anti-slavery lecture to which it had been my lot to listen. Mrs. Auld evidently felt the force of what he said, and like an obedient wife began to shape her course in the direction indicated by him. The effect of his words on me was neither slight nor transitory. His iron sentences, cold and harsh, sunk like heavy weights deep into my heart, and stirred up within me a rebellion not soon to be allayed. This was a new and special revelation, dispelling a painful mystery against which my youthful understanding had struggled and struggled in vain, to wit, the white man's power to perpetuate the enslavement of the black man. Very well, thought I, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. I instinctively assented to the proposition, and from that moment I understood the direct pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I needed, and it came to me at a time and from a source whence I least expected it. Of course, I was greatly saddened at the thought of losing the assistance of my kind mistress, but the information so instantly derived to some extent compensated me for the loss I had sustained in this direction. Wise as Mr. Auld was, he underrated my comprehension, and had little idea of the use to which I was capable of putting the impressive lesson he was giving his wife. He wanted me to be a slave. I had already voted against that on the home plantation of Colonel Lloyd. That which he most loved, I most hated, and the very determination which he expressed to keep me in ignorance only rendered me the more resolute to seek intelligence. In learning to read, therefore, I am not sure that I do not owe quite as much to the opposition of my master as to the kindly assistance of my amiable mistress. I acknowledge the benefit rendered me by the one and by the other, believing that but for my mistress I might have grown up in ignorance. I lived in the family of Mr. Auld at Baltimore 7 years, during which time, as the almanac makers say of the weather, my condition was variable. The most interesting feature of my history here was my learning to read and write under somewhat marked disadvantages. In attaining this knowledge, I was compelled to resort to indirections by no means congenial to my nature, and which were really humiliating to my sense of candor and uprightness. My mistress, checked in her benevolent designs toward me, not only ceased instructing me herself, but set her face as a flint against my learning to read by any means. The conviction once thoroughly established in her mind that education and slavery were incompatible with each other, I was most narrowly watched in all my movements. If I remained in a separate room from the family for any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. But this was too late. The first and never to be retraced step had been taken. Teaching me the alphabet had been the inch given. I was now waiting only for the opportunity to take the L. Filled with the determination to learn to read at any cost, I hit upon many expedients to accomplish that much desired end. The plan which I mainly adopted, and the one which was the most successful, was that of using my young white playmates with whom I met on the streets as teachers. I used to carry almost constantly a copy of Webster's spelling book in my pocket, and when sent on errands or when playtime was allowed me, I would step aside with my young friends and take a lesson in spelling. When I was about 13 years old and had succeeded in learning to read, every increase of knowledge, especially anything respecting the free states, was an additional weight to the almost intolerable burden of my thought, I am a slave for life. To my bondage I could see no end. It was a terrible reality, and I shall never be able to tell how sadly that thought chafed my young spirit. Fortunately or unfortunately, I had earned a little money in blacking boots for some gentlemen, with which I purchased of Mr. Knight on Thames Street what was then a very popular school book, namely the Columbian Orator, for which I paid 50 cents. I was led to buy this book by hearing some little boys say they were going to learn some pieces out of it for the exhibition. This volume was indeed a rich treasure, and every opportunity afforded me for a time was spent in diligently perusing it. Among much other interesting matter, that which I read again and again with unflagging satisfaction was a short dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave is represented as having been recaptured in a second attempt to run away, and the master opens the dialogue with an upbraiding speech, charging the slave with ingratitude, and demanding to know what he has to say in his own defense. Thus upbraided, and thus called upon to reply, the slave rejoins that he knows how little anything that he can say will avail, seeing that he is completely in the hands of his owner, and with noble resolution calmly says, I submit to my fate. Touched by the slave's answer, the master insists upon his further speaking, and recapitulates the many acts of kindness which he has performed toward the slave, and tells him he is permitted to speak for himself. Thus invited, the quondam slave made a spirited defense of himself, and thereafter the whole argument for and against slavery is brought out. The master was vanquished at every turn in the argument, and appreciating the fact, he generously and meekly emancipates the slave, with his best wishes for his prosperity. It is unnecessary to say that a dialogue with such an origin and such an end, read by me when every nerve of my being was in revolt at my own condition as a slave, affected me most powerfully. I could not help feeling that the day might yet come when the well-directed answers made by the slave to the master in this instance would find a counterpart in my own experience. This, however, was not all the fanaticism which I found in the Columbian Orator. I met there one of Sheridan's mighty speeches on the subject of Catholic emancipation, Lord Chatham's speech on the American War, and speeches by the great William Pitt and by Fox. These were all choice documents to me, and I read them over and over again with an interest ever increasing, because it was ever gaining in intelligence, for the more I read them, the better I understood them. The reading of these speeches added much to my limited stock of language, and enabled me to give tongue to many interesting thoughts which had often flashed through my mind and died away for want of words in which to give them utterance. The mighty power and heart-searching directness of truth, penetrating the heart of a slaveholder, compelling him to yield up his earthly interests to the claims of eternal justice, were finely illustrated in the dialogue. And from the speeches of Sheridan I got a bold and powerful denunciation of oppression, and a most brilliant vindication of the rights of man. I resolved to add to my educational attainments the art of writing. After this manner I began to learn to write. I was much in the shipyard, Master Hugh's and that of Durgan and Bailey, and I observed that the carpenters, after hewing and getting ready a piece of timber to use, wrote on it the initials of the name of that part of the ship for which it was intended. When, for instance, a piece of timber was ready for the starboard side, it was marked with a capital S. A piece for the larboard side was marked L. Larboard forward was marked LF, larboard aft was marked LA, starboard aft SA, and starboard forward SF. I soon learned these letters, and for what they were placed on the timbers. My work now was to keep fire under the steam box, and to watch the shipyard while the carpenters had gone to dinner. This interval gave me a fine opportunity for copying the letters named. I soon astonished myself with the ease with which I made the letters, and the thought was soon present, if I can make 4 letters, I can make more. Having made these readily and easily, when I met boys about the Bethel Church or on any of our playgrounds, I entered the lists with them in the art of writing, and would make the letters which I had been so fortunate as to learn, and ask them to beat that if they could. With playmates for my teachers, fences and pavements for my copybooks, and chalk for my pen and ink, I learned to write. I, however, adopted afterward various methods for improving my hand. The most successful was copying the italics in Webster's spelling book until I could make them all without looking on the book. By this time, my little Master Tommy had grown to be a big boy and had written over a number of copybooks and brought them home. They had been shown to the neighbors, had elicited due praise, and had been laid carefully away. Spending parts of my time both at the shipyard and the house, I was often the lone keeper of the latter as of the former. When my mistress left me in charge of the house, I had a grand time. I got Master Tommy's copybooks and a pen and ink, and in the ample spaces between the lines, I wrote other lines as nearly like his as possible. The process was a tedious one, and I ran the risk of getting a flogging for marking the highly prized copybooks of the oldest son. In addition to these opportunities, sleeping as I did in the kitchen loft, a room seldom visited by any of the family, I contrived to get a flour barrel up there and a chair, and upon the head of that barrel I have written, or endeavored to write, copying from the Bible and the Methodist hymn book and other books which I had accumulated till late at night, and when all the family were in bed and asleep. In Chapter 14, Douglass is sent to work for Hugh's brother, Thomas Auld, in St. Michael's, Maryland. In Baltimore, I could occasionally get into a Sabbath school amongst the free children, and receive lessons with the rest, but having learned to read and write already, I was more a teacher than a scholar even there. When, however, I went back to the Eastern Shore and was at the house of Master Thomas, I was not allowed either to teach or to be taught. The whole community, with but one single exception among the whites, frowned upon everything like imparting instruction either to slaves or to free-colored persons. That single exception, a pious young man named Wilson, asked me one day if I would like to assist him in teaching a little Sabbath school at the house of a free colored man named James Mitchell. The idea to me was a delightful one, and I told him I would gladly devote as much of my Sabbaths as I could command to that most laudable work. Mr. Wilson soon mustered up a dozen old spelling books and a few testaments, and we commenced operations with some 20 scholars in our school. Here, thought I, is something worth living for. Here is a chance for usefulness. The first Sunday passed delightfully, and I spent the week after very joyously. At our second meeting, I learned there were some objections to the existence of our school, and sure enough, we had scarcely got to work, Good work, simply teaching a few colored children how to read the gospel of the Son of God, when in rushed a mob, and with them Master Thomas. They were armed with sticks and other missiles and drove us off, commanding us never to meet for such a purpose again. In Chapter 18, Douglass is sent to work at the farm of William Freeland, where he finds potential students. Henry and John Harris were brothers and belonged to Mr. Freeland. They were both remarkably bright and intelligent, though neither of them could read. Now for mischief. I had not been long here before I was up to my old tricks. I began to address my companions on the subject of education and the advantages of intelligence over ignorance, and as far as I dared, I tried to show the agency of ignorance in keeping men in slavery. Webster's Spelling Book and the Columbian Orator were looked into again. As summer came on, and the long Sabbath days stretched themselves over our idleness, I became uneasy and wanted a Sabbath school where to exercise my gifts and to impart the little knowledge I possessed to my brother slaves. A house was hardly necessary in the summertime. I could hold my school under the shade of an old oak tree as well as anywhere else. The thing was to get the scholars and to have them thoroughly imbued with the idea to learn. 2 such boys were quickly found in Henry and John, and from them the contagion spread. I was not long in bringing around me 20 or 30 young men who enrolled themselves gladly in my Sabbath school, and were willing to meet me regularly under the trees or elsewhere, for the purpose of learning to read. It was surprising with what ease they provided themselves with spelling books. These were mostly the cast-off books of their young masters or mistresses. I taught at first on our own farm. All were impressed with the necessity of keeping the matter as private as possible, for the fate of the St. Michael's attempt was still fresh in the minds of all. Our pious masters at St. Michael's must not know that a few of their dusky brothers were learning to read the Word of God, lest they should come down upon us with a lash and chain. We might have met to drink whiskey, to wrestle, fight, and to do other unseemly things, with no fear of interruption from the saints or the sinners of St. Michael's. But to meet for the purpose of improving the mind and heart by learning to read the sacred Scriptures was a nuisance to be instantly stopped. After getting the school nicely started a second time, holding it in the woods behind the barn and in the shade of trees, I succeeded in inducing a free colored man who lived several miles from our house to permit me to hold my school in a room at his house. He incurred much peril in doing so, for the assemblage was an unlawful one. I had at one time more than 40 scholars, all of the right sort, and many of them succeeded in learning to read. I have had various employments during my life, but I look back to none with more satisfaction.